They say betrayal never comes from your enemies, but I never expected it to smell like stale lilies and a zeroed-out bank balance. My name is Ava, and for 3 years, I thought I was building a life with a woman who was my rock, my partner, and the person who made me realize there was more good in the world than bad. Elena was everything to me, or so I thought while she was supposedly visiting family in Spain, leaving me to manage our small floral boutique on the corner of 5th and Main. The shop was my creative sanctuary, 1,000 square feet of color and life that I nurtured while she handled the business side of things, since she always told me that business was not my forte. But this morning, the morning that changed everything, the silence in the shop felt heavy, like the air before a storm. I sat at the old oak desk and opened a letter that looked far too official to be a bill. My heart didn't just drop, it disintegrated. The mortgage hadn't been paid for months. The bank account we shared, the one where every penny of my hard-earned savings lived, was drained down to nothing. I remember staring at the screen of my laptop, praying for a glitch that never came. Elena hadn't just gone on a trip, she had systematically erased our future. I felt like I was suffocating amidst the scent of fresh eucalyptus and roses, and for a moment, I actually started talking to the flowers as if they could offer advice. I tried calling her, my fingers trembling, but every call went straight to that cold, automated voice message system. Just 48 hours. That was all the time the bank was giving me before they padlocked the doors of the only place I ever truly called home. I was standing in the ruins of a life I hadn't even realized was collapsing around me. I had trusted her wholeheartedly, only to find out I was just another victim in her long-running scam. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that usually meant a customer, but today it sounded like a funeral knell. I didn't even look up as I wiped a stray tear from my cheek, my voice cracking as I whispered that we were closed. But the person standing there didn't leave. They didn't want flowers. They were looking at me with a look of pity that made my blood run cold. Little did I know, the woman standing in my doorway, Harper, was about to tell me that she had been tracking Elena for months because she had been scammed too. She stepped into the shop, her eyes scanning the empty shelves and the neglected displays that I had been too distracted to fix. She wasn't here to buy a bouquet for a wedding or a funeral. She was here because she knew exactly what it felt like to have the rug pulled out from under her just a week before she was supposed to get married. As I sat there in my small-town boutique, surrounded by the remnants of my broken dreams, I realized that the person I had shared my bed with was a stranger I never really knew. The light hitting the glass window felt like a mockery of the darkness in my chest. I was broke, I was alone, and in 2 days, I would be homeless. I looked at Harper, her presence both a threat and a potential lifeline, wondering if this was the final blow or the start of something I couldn't yet imagine. The air in the floral shop was thick with the scent of lilies and the cold realization of my own stupidity. Harper stood there, her eyes not filled with the pity I expected, but with a sharp, calculating intensity that made me pull my cardigan tighter around my chest. She did not move toward the counter or reach for a sympathy card. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a smartphone, sliding it across the wood that was still stained with the water from this morning's arrangements. I looked down at the screen and felt a new kind of chill. There were photos of Elena. Not the smiling, candid shots I had taken during our weekend trips to the coast, but grainy, distant images of her at airports, in coffee shops, and standing outside buildings I did not recognize. Harper told me she had been following her for months, tracking the woman I thought I loved like she was a fugitive from justice. I asked her who she really was, my voice sounding like it belonged to a ghost. She did not hesitate when she told me that Elena had vanished from her life exactly 7 days before they were supposed to walk down the aisle. She described the same empty bank accounts, the same fabricated excuses about business trips, and the same calculated charm that had blinded me for 3 years. Every word she spoke was like a mirror reflecting my own nightmare. Harper explained that she had heard about this shop through a mutual contact who had mentioned Elena was connected to a small-scale floral boutique. She had applied for the job not because she needed the work, but because she knew Elena would eventually return to the scene of her latest crime to collect whatever was left. I felt a surge of anger that almost surpassed my grief. I had let this woman into my sanctuary, shared my secrets with her, and all the while she was using me as bait to catch her own ghost. I told her to get out, that I could not handle another lie in a room already filled with them. But Harper did not flinch. She pointed to the legal notices on my desk and told me that the bank did not care about my broken heart. She said that Elena was a professional who had done this at least 4 times that she could prove. We were not just 2 women who were unlucky in love. We were marks in a long-running confidence game. Harper's voice was steady as she proposed an alliance that felt as dangerous as it was necessary. She had the evidence to put Elena away, but she needed me to stay in the shop and act like nothing was wrong. She needed me to be the lure that would bring Elena back for one last score. I looked at the flowers around me, their petals already beginning to curl at the edges, and realized that I had 48 hours before my world was padlocked shut. I could either surrender to the silence or I could listen to the woman who understood my pain better than anyone else on this earth. I reached out and took the phone, looking at Elena's face, and for the first time since I opened that letter, the fear in my gut was replaced by a cold, hard desire for justice. Choosing to trust a stranger when your world is already on fire feels like pouring gasoline on the flames, but as the clock on the wall of my boutique ticked toward midnight, I realized I was out of options. I looked at Harper, really looked at her this time, noticing the exhaustion behind her sharp eyes and the way she held her shoulders like she was ready for a fight that never ended. She told me that Elena would be back within 36 hours because Elena was a creature of habit who could not resist the urge to see the final collapse of her handiwork. We stood in the center of my shop, surrounded by 500 square feet of greenery and the suffocating scent of jasmine, and I felt a strange shift in the air. I told Harper that I would do it, that I would play the part of the grieving, confused partner while we set the trap that would finally end the path of destruction. We spent the remainder of the night turning my sanctuary into a stage, meticulously documenting every empty ledger and every fraudulent transaction that Elena had hidden under layers of digital deception. Harper moved through the shadows of the shop with a practiced efficiency, showing me how to back up the cloud storage and how to trigger the silent alarm that was hidden beneath the heavy oak counter. I did not feel like a florist anymore. I felt like an actor preparing for the most dangerous opening night of my life. Every time the bell above the door moved in the drafty air, my heart leaped into my throat, fearing it was her, but the steady presence of Harper kept me grounded. She explained that we were not just fighting for the money or the mortgage payments. We were fighting for the pieces of ourselves that Elena had stolen. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon of our small town, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor, we forged a bond that was rooted in shared pain and a desperate need for closure. I watched the sun hit the glass storefront and realized that the woman I had loved was a ghost I had created in my own mind, but the woman standing next to me was real, and her anger was a fire that could finally burn away the lies. We had less than 2 days to save the life I had built, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was no longer standing alone in the ruins. We were 2 victims who were tired of being silent, and as we prepared the shop for the morning customers, we knew that the next person to walk through those doors would be the one to face the storm we were brewing together. Every petal and every leaf in this building was now part of a plan that went far beyond selling bouquets. We were waiting for the architect of our misery to walk into her own trap. The air was cold, the coffee was bitter, but for the first time in weeks, my hands were not shaking. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that usually signaled the start of a busy day, but today it felt like the tolling of a bell at a funeral. I stood behind the counter of my floral boutique, my hands buried in a bucket of cold water, clutching a bunch of stems so hard they nearly snapped. I had spent the last several hours rehearsing every word, every breath, and every tear, but when Elena finally walked through that door, looking as radiant and composed as the day she left, my heart nearly failed me. She was wearing that expensive designer trench coat, the one I had helped her pick out for her supposed family trip to Spain, and she carried a small bag from the bakery down the street as if this were just another ordinary Tuesday morning. She walked toward me with that practiced, effortless smile, the one that used to make me feel like the luckiest woman in the world, but now it looked like a mask made of cold porcelain. She reached across the counter to touch my cheek, whispering that she was so sorry for the silence and that her phone had been stolen in a crowded market in Barcelona. I did not pull away. I forced myself to stand still, feeling the phantom weight of Harper's presence in the back room, watching through the small gap in the heavy velvet curtain. I looked Elena in the eye and asked her about the mortgage and the bank account, my voice shaking with a genuine grief that I did not have to fake. She did not even flinch. She started spinning a web of lies about a business investment that had gone wrong and how she had to move the money to protect our future from a legal complication she could not explain yet. She told me that the intention behind her actions was what mattered most, not the temporary damage to our credit or my peace of mind. It was a line so perfectly rehearsed that it made my skin crawl. I let her talk for 5 minutes, watching the way she manipulated the air in the room, until I finally whispered that her time was up. The confusion on her face was almost beautiful in its rarity. That was when Harper stepped out from the shadows of the refrigerated flower case, her expression as hard as flint and her eyes locked onto the woman who had ruined her life. The moment Elena saw her, the mask did not just slip, it shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She tried to stammer out a name, but no words would come. She realized then that her two worlds had collided in the one place she thought she was safe. I told her that I knew everything, from the unpaid mortgage to the woman she had abandoned a week before their wedding day. Elena looked at the door, her instincts screaming at her to run, but I had already locked the entrance and the silent alarm was already calling for help from the local precinct. We stood there, two women who had been treated like stepping stones, watching the architect of our pain finally realize she had nowhere left to hide. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing through the quiet streets of our small town, I felt the heavy burden of the last 48 hours begin to lift. We were not just victims anymore. We were the storm that she never saw coming. The scent of the roses was no longer suffocating. It was the smell of a victory I never thought I would see. The flashing blue and red lights finally faded into the distance, leaving the street corner in a silence that felt heavier than the chaos that had just unfolded. Elena was gone, led away in handcuffs, her expensive designer coat looking like a costume from a play that had finally closed its curtains. I stood in the middle of the shop, the floorboards still damp from the spilled water of the confrontation, and felt a strange emptiness where the fear used to be. Harper was there, leaning against the oak counter, her breathing finally slowing down. She looked at me with a soft expression, the hardness in her eyes replaced by something that looked a lot like relief. The bank arrived the next morning, but the broker friend Harper had mentioned had already worked his miracles, securing a loan that would allow me to keep the boutique and begin the long process of rebuilding my credit. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, legal documents, and meetings with the district attorney. We stood together in that courtroom when the judge dropped the hammer, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without a weight on my chest. Elena was sentenced to 2 years, which felt light considering the lives she had dismantled, but at least it was finally over. There was no more looking over our shoulders and no more searching for shadows in every doorway. I remember sitting on the steps of the shop with Harper after the final hearing, 2 cups of steaming coffee between us. I told her she was an actual lifesaver and thanked her for staying when she had every reason to walk away. She told me that while the circumstances were terrible, meeting me was the one thing she would never trade back. We had both been blindsided by the same person, but in the ruins of those betrayals, we had found something real and honest. I asked her if she wanted to grab a drink somewhere that was not my place of work, and she laughed, telling me that she thought making an exception to company policy was well within my rights as the boss. The seasons began to change, and the lilies were replaced by autumn mums and then winter evergreens. The boutique flourished, not just as a business, but as a testament to the fact that there are silver linings even in the darkest storms. One evening, as the sun set over the town, casting a warm golden glow over the displays of fresh blooms, I looked at Harper and realized that we were just a couple of idiots who had finally figured out we were perfect for each other. We were no longer victims defined by the greed of another person. We were 2 people building a life on a foundation of truth. The future did not look like a series of empty bank statements and broken promises anymore. It looked like the woman standing next to me, and for the first time in my life, I was not afraid to see what was coming next because I knew we would face it together. The morning sun streamed through the front window of the boutique, casting a warm glow over a fresh shipment of peonies that filled the air with a sweet and intoxicating scent. It had been nearly 2 years since the nightmare with Elena had come to a final end, and the shop was finally thriving in a way I never thought was possible. Harper walked through the front door, the familiar chime of the bell now a sound of comfort rather than a source of anxiety. She was carrying 2 large cardboard cups of coffee from the bakery down the street, the steam rising in the cool morning air. She set them down on the heavy oak counter, the very same counter where we had once planned our desperate trap to catch a thief. She looked at me with a mischievous glint in her eyes, a look that still made my heart skip a beat after all this time. We had spent the last 24 months rebuilding not just a business, but a life that was centered on honesty and mutual respect. Harper reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, sliding it across the counter next to my caffeinated peace offering. She told me that she had heard there was a big event coming up that was going to need a significant amount of floral arrangements and professional planning. I looked at her, confused, and asked her who exactly was getting married in our small town. She laughed, a sound that filled the quiet corners of the shop, and said that it was just a couple of idiots who had finally realized they were perfect for each other. My breath caught in my throat as she opened the box to reveal a simple and elegant band that caught the golden morning light. She asked me if I would be willing to put up with her forever, and I felt a tear prick at the corner of my eye. I looked at the coffee, then at the ring, and then at the woman who had saved my soul when it was drifting in the dark. I asked her if the deal included unlimited coffee refills for the rest of my natural life. She smiled, pulling me into a warm hug that felt like coming home after a long and exhausting journey, and she promised me a lifetime supply of whatever I needed. I realized then that the bright side we had talked about was not just about surviving a tragedy, it was about the beautiful and unexpected things that grow in the soil of our greatest challenges. As we stood there among the blooms, I knew that the future was finally ours to write, one petal at a time. The shop was no longer a place of secrets and debt, it was a sanctuary of love and new beginnings. I said yes, not just to the ring, but to the life we had built from the cold ashes of our past. We were no longer victims of a clever scam. We were the architects of our own happiness, and for the first time, the path ahead was clear and bright. Every flower in the shop seemed to bloom a little brighter as we stood there, 2 people who had found light in the middle of a storm. We had turned our shared adversity into a foundation that was stronger than anything Elena could have ever imagined. The journey had been long and painful, but standing here with Harper, I knew that every struggle had led me exactly where I was meant to be. Our love was not a hidden secret or a calculated move. It was the honest truth of 2 hearts that had chosen to bloom together. The morning of our wedding, the air inside the boutique felt different, as if the very walls had finally exhaled the last remnants of the fear and suspicion that had once lived here for so long. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by 600 square feet of breathtaking floral arrangements that I had meticulously designed myself. Each petal and leaf a testament to the life Harper and I had built from the cold ashes of a devastating betrayal. There were no hidden ledgers today, no empty bank accounts to worry about, and no shadows lurking in the corners where the heavy, cloying scent of lilies used to feel like a funeral shroud. I adjusted the white silk of my wedding dress, feeling the weight of the moment press against my chest in the best possible way, a heart that was finally full instead of hollow. Harper walked in through the back door, looking absolutely radiant in a tailored charcoal suit that made her sharp eyes look like a stormy sea that had finally been calmed by the morning sun. She did not say a word at first. She just stood there by the door, taking in the total transformation of the space we had once used as a tactical battleground against a common enemy. We had come a long way from the night we sat on these very linoleum floors, drinking bitter coffee from paper cups and planning how to bring down the woman who had tried to break both of our spirits. Elena was a distant and fading memory now, a name on a yellowed legal document that no longer held any power over our hearts or our shared future. As the guests began to arrive, filling the small shop with the sound of genuine, warm laughter and the rustle of festive clothing, I realized that this boutique had become a sanctuary not just for flowers, but for the absolute and unvarnished truth. We stood before our friends and family, our hands joined firmly over the same heavy oak counter where we had once signed the desperate loan papers that had saved my dream from the auction block. The ceremony was simple and intimate, but every word spoken by the officiant felt like a solid, unbreakable brick being laid in a foundation that would never crumble again. We spoke our vows with voices that did not shake, honoring the unexpected light that had led us to each other, and the way that shared adversity had forged a bond far stronger than any romantic illusion created by a professional con artist. When the officiant finally declared us partners for life, the thunderous applause from the room was not just for our marriage, but for the hard-won victory we had secured together over the darkness of our past. We did not need an expensive honeymoon in a foreign land or a grand, empty gesture to feel complete. We had the quiet, unwavering certainty of knowing that we were exactly where we were supposed to be, standing in the light. As the sun began to set over our quiet American town, casting long and beautiful golden fingers across the rows of fresh roses, hydrangeas, and eucalyptus, I looked at Harper and saw my entire future reflected in her honest and loving smile. We had turned a crime scene into a magnificent celebration and a soul-crushing betrayal into a beautiful and lasting beginning. The scent of the flowers was no longer a mask for lies, but the sweet fragrance of a promise kept and a life reclaimed. We were no longer victims or even just survivors. We were simply two people who had found their way home through the most unlikely of storms, and as I kissed my wife, I knew that every single thorn we had encountered on this road had been worth the beautiful bloom we were holding in our hands right now. 1 year had passed since we stood behind that heavy oak counter and promised to face the world together, and as I looked around the shop today, the memory of that zeroed-out bank balance felt like a nightmare from another lifetime. The boutique was no longer just a small corner shop. We had expanded into the vacant space next door, doubling our floor plan to nearly 2,000 square feet of floral excellence that had become the talk of the county. I watched Harper through the glass of our new office, her head down as she meticulously organized the delivery schedules for 3 different weddings this weekend. Unlike Elena, who used numbers as a weapon of deception, Harper used them as a shield to protect everything we had built, ensuring that every cent was accounted for and every bill was paid well in advance. I walked over to her with a fresh cup of coffee, the steam curling into the air, and she looked up with that same honest smile that had become my favorite sight in the world. We had spent the morning preparing a special arrangement of white lilies and blue hydrangeas for a local charity event, and the scent in the room was no longer suffocating, but a reminder of the growth that can happen after a fire. I mentioned to her that I had seen a news clipping about Elena being released on parole in a different state, and for the first time, my heart did not skip a beat with fear. She was just a ghost now, a character in a story that had a happy ending she was no longer part of. Harper took a sip of her coffee and reminded me that our lifetime supply of caffeine was still going strong, just like the promise she had made me on that snowy morning when she proposed. We had taken the fragments of our broken trust and glued them back together with a transparency that most people never get to experience. I leaned against the counter, looking at the vibrant rows of sunflowers and roses, and realized that the silver lining was not just about the success of the business or the safety of our home. It was about the fact that I could close my eyes at night and know exactly who was sleeping next to me. We were not just 2 women who had been scammed by the same person. We were 2 architects who had built a monument to resilience. The bell above the door chimed, and instead of flinching, I felt a rush of excitement to see who was coming in to share in the beauty we had created. As the afternoon sun hit the polished wood floors, I knew that no matter what storms might come our way in the future, our roots were now buried so deep that nothing could ever pull us apart again. Every single flower in this room was a living proof that even the most damaged hearts can bloom more beautifully than before if they are given the right environment and the right person to hold the watering can. The town had come to know us not as the victims of a high-profile fraud, but as the owners of the most successful boutique on Main Street, a place where honesty was just as important as the quality of our stems. We had found a way to turn our darkest hour into our greatest strength, and as I looked at the wedding band on my finger, I knew that the best chapters of our lives were still waiting to be written. The struggle had been real, the loss had been immense, but the life we had cultivated together was worth every single tear we had shed in the dark. 5 years had passed since the day the world felt like it was ending in a pile of unpaid bills and broken promises, and as I stood in the center of our expanded boutique, the memory of that betrayal felt like a story belonging to someone else entirely. The shop now occupied 3 storefronts, a grand 3,000 square feet of botanical wonder that had become the heart and soul of our small American town. I stood by the large bay window, watching the morning light dance across a vibrant display of wild sunflowers, and I realized that I no longer counted the days since Elena was released from prison. She was a shadow that had long ago been chased away by the bright and steady light of the life I shared with Harper. Our marriage had grown like the perennials we sold, deep-rooted and resilient enough to weather any season of life. We had just finished a massive contract for the summer festival of the city, and the air was filled with the smell of sweet pea and fresh rain. Harper walked in from the warehouse area, her hands stained with the green of 1,000 stems, and she rested her chin on my shoulder with a sigh of contentment. She told me that she had just finalized the paperwork for our first community scholarship fund, a program we started to help young women who were trying to rebuild their lives after facing extreme financial hardship or domestic betrayal. It was our way of turning the dirt of our past into fertilizer for the future of someone else. Just as she was about to pull me into a hug, the bell above the door chimed, a sound that no longer brought a sense of dread. A young woman stepped inside, her eyes red from crying and a crumpled legal document clutched in her hand so tightly that her knuckles were white. She looked exactly the way I did on that Tuesday morning 5 years ago, lost and completely blindsided by a world that had suddenly turned cold. I did not need to ask what was wrong. I could see the same flickering flame of betrayal in the way she held her breath. I looked at Harper, and without a single word, she knew exactly what I was thinking. We did not just sell flowers anymore. We provided a sanctuary for those who thought the storm would never end. I walked around the counter and handed the girl a single, perfect white rose, telling her that the worst day of her life might actually be the beginning of the best one she could ever imagine. As I led her to the back room where the coffee was always hot and the truth was always welcome, I felt a profound sense of peace. We had taken a crime and turned it into a legacy of kindness. The betrayal that once threatened to destroy me had become the very foundation of my strength. I looked back at Harper, who was already pulling up a chair for our guest, and I knew that we were no longer just survivors of a clever scam. We were the light at the end of the tunnel for anyone who was lost in the dark. The scent of the shop was no longer heavy with the secrets of the past. It was light, hopeful, and blooming with 1,000 new possibilities. We had found our silver lining, and now we were busy making sure everyone else could find theirs too. Our love was the greatest bloom of all.